Well, a very good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here in the Grand Salon for another conversation. Firstly, has everyone been enjoying Andrew's conversations? I'm hearing great feedback from many of you on all of our speakers, and here to have another wonderful one, sporting a wonderful attire today, very much looking the part. Let's give a round of applause to Mr. Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much indeed. And Nick, Derek, and Georgia, thank you so much for the leadership, the coordination. It makes it so much better for us and for our guests. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Jeffrey and Nico for making it all happen technologically. Well done, guys. Because we all come on here with all sorts of different bits of technology. And even yesterday, I emailed Jeffrey an update of this presentation because I decided to ask ChatGPT what I might look like if I were on safari at this time of year. And it sent me this. So I'm trying to decide whether I should go for that beard or not. I don't know. Kathy and I have been very lucky. Over the years, we've been on various safaris. Let me take this thing off. We've been on various safaris in South Africa, in Senegal, in Sri Lanka. We've driven across the desert in Namibia and up to Etosha. And we've had some great experiences. But this is not our vacation show. I'm not here to talk about our holidays. However, you know I have an interest in science, and bearing in mind that we're talking about seeing creatures, I thought I'd look at the independent side of some of the creatures around. For example, this one. Or maybe this one. And then there is the dog that decided to take the law into his own hands, or mouth, namely this one. Now, on a more serious note, you will probably remember the story of Cecil the lion, who was shot a few years ago by a poacher who had paid for a permit, to go out shooting. He worked with a crossbow. He shot and debilitated the lion, and the following day, when the lion reappeared in its weakened state, he killed it. He believed that he had the permission to do this, but this lion was a national symbol in Zimbabwe of the controls over safari. He was protected by law. He was collared, resident in the Hwange National Park, which is a protected reserve. So there are some risks involved in this. That the hunter had paid $50,000 for the permit to go out shooting with his crossbow. And whatever your views on hunting for sport may be, and I'm certainly not going to make any judgments on that, it seems almost certain that he had no idea that he was breaking the law, because the law in Zimbabwe specifically prevented him from doing that. But as in our countries, ignorance of the law is no defense in court, of course. So the whole subject of killing for sport among such magnificent creatures was brought right up to the fore when that happened. The lion was one of an endangered species, and across the continent, lion numbers have plummeted by 80% over the past century, from 200,000 to an estimated 24,000. Mostly the result of poaching, not of trophy hunting, and human development, people moving into their territories. 100 elephant are killed every day by poachers. And I emphasize by poachers, not by hunters. Mostly just for the ivory. And at the current rate, there will be no African elephant and no rhino in the wild in 20 years' time. Numbers of this magnificent creature are in serious decline. Some countries earn quite a lot from hunting tourism, but they earn a lot more from responsible photo safari trade. And I'm going to talk about the two, and I make no judgment. I'm just going to talk about how safari has developed. Safari is a Swahili word which means a journey, originally from the Arabic safaria. It means any journey. So if you're catching a bus from, from Nairobi to Mombasa, or a ferry from Dar es Salaam to Unguja, or you're on a luxury cruise ship sailing down the South Atlantic and heading into the Indian Ocean, you are on safari in Swahili terms. It entered the English language at the end of the 1850s, thanks to Richard Francis Burton, who was a famous explorer. Now, this is a photo of the lookout in the middle of the savannah in northeastern Botswana, at one of the largest salt flats in the world, and with a very unique form of safari. So many places have specifics to their own area. I can't get into all of the individuals, but all I would suggest is if you've been on safari and you're planning to go again, think very carefully and try to choose somewhere different, because you will see different creatures and you'll see them in a different environment. Back to the word safari. The regimental march of the King's African Rifles, the famous KAR, was Funga Safari, which literally means tie up the march, or in other words, pack up the equipment, ready to go on a journey. On Kenya's independence from Britain, under the first president of the Republic, the founding father of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, and this was in 1963, Funga Safari was retained as the regimental march of the Kenya Rifles, the successors to the King's African Rifles. Today, many operators throughout Asian and African countries, in fact, all over the world really, offer various types of safari service. As the lodge-based tours where you stay in one place and go out. There are sort of peripatetic lodge tours where you'll go from one lodge site to another. There are tented camps where you move by day, often traveling by air. There are fly-in safaris where you will arrive and the expedition leaders will greet you when you land. There are mobile safari, all sorts of different options, and all of them led by, or I hope all the professional ones at least, led by excellent safari guides who know where to take you, and with great equipment as well, of course. The mobile safari is very popular in Africa, and it offers guests a genuine safari experience, a real sense that you are in the environment. They're ecologically friendly because they move on, and so they don't impact the environment as much. They allow the environment to regenerate, and the wildlife doesn't become habituated to human presence, as they can do where there is a permanent lodge site. In 1836, William Cornwallis Harris led an expedition purely to observe and record wildlife. Wildlife and landscapes. And so the exhibition members included artists and writers, and so they produced records of what they saw. So he established a form of safari journey. They started with a gentle rise at first light, an energetic day of walking, an afternoon rest, and then concluding with a formal dinner and sharing the stories in the evening over drinks and tobacco. And possibly with the exception of tobacco, that is still the format for many safaris today. Jules Verne's first novel, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, which was published in 1863, and H. Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines, published about 20 years later, both describe journeys of English travellers on safari, and they were bestsellers in their day. And incidentally, Rider Haggard was a near neighbour of my family, so my mother was very proud of the fact that she knew his family, and they lived not far away. Now, these books gave rise to a genre of movies and adventure novels about the white man in Africa on safari. There were countless hours of cinema based on safaris, particularly once sound came along. So 1931 onwards, we had Trader Horn. Safari was used in many adventure film series, such as Tarzan, Jungle Jim, Bomber the Jungle Boy, The Naked Prey in 1966, where Cornell Wilde, you might remember, a white hunter, becomes game himself, and the excitement rose. And then, of course, The Jungle Book, which is talking about wildlife in the wild with human contact. The safari genre were parodied in Bob Hope's movies, The Road to Zanzibar and Call Me Bwana, which were very, very popular. On a more serious note, an instant 15-minute helicopter safari was shown in Africa Adio, which means farewell to Africa. Clients were armed, they were flown from their hotel, they landed in front of an unlucky and unsuspecting elephant. One of the most controversial films ever made in Africa. It shows a unique view of the continent and a very different picture from the image that Idi Amin, for example, was trying to create. It was shot over 3 years in several different countries, and the filmmakers set out to construct a panorama of chaos engulfing Africa in the immediate aftermath of colonialism, and I think they succeeded. They deliberately focused on the most shocking moments of mass upheaval and localized violence. The Hutu versus the Tutsis, the Mau Mau, the white mercenaries in Congo, etc. It was a shocking film. Out of Africa has Karen Blixen and Dennis Finch Hatton traveling. Dennis refused to abandon home comforts. He used fine china, crystal glasses. He drank fine wine. He listened to Mozart recordings on his gramophone while on their safari trip. And they sat in comfortable furniture and they slept on comfortable beds. Much of the colonial governments of Burma and India and places in Africa lived their day-to-day lives in just that style. Tourists have tended to dress the part with appropriate clothing, so hats, long sleeved shirts. They'd have blankets for when the night gets cold, which it certainly can do at times. And today, safaris have diversified considerably from the initial fledgling expeditions of the pioneering European explorers and colonialists. Tourism is becoming an increasingly prevalent economic factor for many Asian and African countries. In several regions, the growth is leading to an economy greater even than agriculture, which leads to various conditions. the infrastructure, the inherent geography, because of these, countries advertise locally specialized safari experiences. So you will get guided safaris, you'll get mobile safaris, you'll get walking safaris, fly-in safaris, the range of things that I mentioned earlier, even elephant-back safaris or river safaris. There are safaris that are just focused on primates, for example, safaris that are just focused on the big cats. And there are safaris that are specific for photographers, people who specifically want to use good equipment to get great shots. This is from our visit to the Addo Elephant Park near Port Elizabeth. Safaris are also a form of ecotourism in which the public can become educated about the ecosystems and the animal kingdoms of indigenous regions like Africa or Australia. There are professional guides, and through them tourists are provided with safe transportation. There are certified educational programs, there are discovery programs, and there are opportunities for the countries to expand their exploitation if they do it well without damaging the environment. So this is a different version of a map I showed you a week or so ago, showing the movement of humanity out of Africa, and it shows the periods the periods of migration. It's generally assumed that early humankind were hunter-gatherers, hunting for meat protein, foraging for fruit and vegetation. And a hunter-gatherer or a forager society is one in which most, if not all of the food, is found rather than being farmed, which is a much more modern concept. Hunting and gathering was humanity's first and most successful adaptation, occupying at least 90% of human history. Until 12,000 years ago, that was all people knew about how to feed themselves. But following the invention, the creation, the arrival of agriculture, hunter-gatherers have been displaced or conquered in most parts of the world by farming or pastoralist groups. Only a few contemporary societies are classified as hunter-gatherers, and a lot of them supplement their foraging activities with a bit of horticulture or by keeping domesticated animals. This shows 3 indigenous Australians on Bathurst Island. This was taken in 1939. According to Nicholas Peterson, who wrote the book Demographic Transition in a Hunter-Gatherer Population, the island was a population isolated for 6,000 years until the 18th century. Even as recently as 1929, 3/4 of the population supported themselves directly from the bush. Here you see 2 Hasda men. This is in Tanzania. They're returning from a hunt. The Hasda are one of the few contemporary African societies that primarily survive by foraging. Lions are obligate carnivores. So a little bit of definition here. A major component of their diet is the flesh of large animals like this African buffalo. We'll move on from that. So let's take a look at dictionary definitions. A carnivore means a meat eater, from the Latin caro, meaning meat or flesh, and vorare, meaning to devour. Carnivore is an organism that derives its energy and nutrient requirements from a diet consisting mainly or exclusively of animal tissue, whether through predation or scavenging. You can see the sharp teeth on this Bengal tiger, a clear symbol, a clear indication that this is an animal that expects to predate, to tear apart the flesh of the animals, that the bodies that it finds or captures. Taking definitions just a little bit further, animals that depend solely on the flesh of other creatures for their nutrient requirements are called obligate carnivores, and those with some other nutritional source are called facultative carnivores. But omnivores, and I am an omnivore because I do eat meat, but I eat a lot of other things besides. Omnivores are creatures that will eat some animal flesh and vegetables and fruits and other things as well. Now, it's quite clear that humans can live without meat. After all, many people do, including some of you. But many people would point to our ancestors as evidence that we are meant to eat meat. Although, of course, our style of life has changed dramatically from those working on the right-hand side image to those working on the left-hand side image. For many of us, we have to create exercise in a gym or a pool or a tennis court or walking around the deck or a golf course or whatever it may be, because our lives don't require us to be constantly on the move as our predecessors were. So our calorific demand, let alone our nutrient requirements, are very different. And so there are very strong arguments both ways as to whether you should eat meat or not. Most of us, and I recognise this isn't everyone, and respect those who aren't, but most of us are cultural, optional, or habitual meat eaters. And a lot of people eat meat and enjoy it. A lot of people choose not to eat meat, and they are very happy with that choice. The idea of hunting for anything other than nutrition really is quite recent. It comes with the affluence of the societies in which we live. Even Henry VIII, himself an avid hunter, expected most of what was killed to appear on the dining table. And while animal hunting for most goes back to very early times, as depicted in this illustration of boar hunting from the 14th century manuscript, it's clear that the idea of killing an animal for a trophy or for pleasure is quite a recent thing. Culling for security, protection, or control is a long-standing issue. Today, we'd like to think that culling is a controlled, carefully thought through, rational activity. But of course, we know it can get quite bloody and apparently out of control. If you look at the culling of some seals, for example, in parts of northern Europe, just as an example. And it often pitches one culture against another, those who traditionally respect and expect to cull, and those who choose to object to it. And of course, there are many sports that involve the harm or the killing of animals. Probably the highest profile, at least in our society, is the sport of bullfighting in Spain and Latin cultures. In most of southern France and in Portugal and in parts of Spain, bullfighting does not involve killing, and in many parts it is now banned, in Catalonia, for example. But there are others, and dog baiting, bear baiting still happens in some places. Cockfighting, they're all other examples, mostly running under the radar, mostly illegal, but often uncontrolled and unrestricted. But this is very different to safari, because these animals are domesticated, they're bred for the purpose. And I don't offer that as an excuse. but they are in a very different situation. So these are often caged animals that are bred purely for the purpose of killing one another. Today, many safari parks do breed animals for their purpose, usually to protect endangered species and to secure the bloodline for the future. But there are some that breed for the sole purpose of providing targets for hunters, and hunters who look for a trophy rather than a photo. The idea of hunting purely for pleasure developed over time. In present-day use, lawful hunting is distinguished from poaching, which is the illegal killing, the trapping, the capture of hunted species. The species that are hunted are referred to as game and are usually mammals or birds. But as this Roman mosaic shows, it's certainly not a new idea. Perhaps hunting for the game rather than the table reached a peak at the beginning of the 20th century. The most high-profile activity at the time was the Smithsonian mission led by Theodore Roosevelt. Despite riding the crest of high popularity, he chose not to run again for the presidency in 1908. Instead, he anointed William Howard Taft as his successor. Immediately following Taft's inauguration in 1909, having won the presidential election, Roosevelt set out for Africa to hunt big game and collect specimens for the Smithsonian Institution. His decision was based on his desire to walk away, to put the politics behind him, but also his need for action. He was a man of action. He needed to be doing something very active. In April 1909, he landed in Mombasa with his son Kermit, after whom the frog was named. Roosevelt, at the head of a safari, included 250 porters and guides, trekked across British East Africa, into the Belgian Congo, and back to the Nile, ending in Khartoum. The ex-president thoroughly enjoyed himself. The expedition collected 1,100 specimens, including 500 big game, all of which found their way into exhibitions and research programs. The most noteworthy collection of big game, big animals that has ever come out of Africa was his exclamation. Unfortunately for the animals collected involved being killed, because in those days it was a euphemism for being shot. Between the two of them, Theodore and Kermit slew 512 beasts, including 17 lions, 11 elephants, and 20 rhino. The remaining animals were no doubt quite happy to see them leave the plain. But after the year-long hunt, Roosevelt proceeded to England for the funeral of King Edward VII and then on to Norway to accept the Nobel Prize for Peace for his part in ending the Russo-Japanese War. And he returned to the US in June 1910. Their mission brought down great numbers of various creatures. There was praise and there was condemnation. It's estimated that some 10,000 creatures lost their lives. Roosevelt himself certainly enjoyed the kill. Like others, he referred to it as a sport. But the sheer volume of creatures who were killed or who suffered, who were killed. I'm not sure they left any suffering, but those who were killed and then taken back and stuffed and put on display, it provided an impressive source of research material that at the time couldn't have been gained in any way other than cutting up an animal. Today, of course, with MRI and various other things, just a quick anesthetic can put an animal out for long enough to scan and to understand whatever it is that we're looking at. Now, this man was instrumental in changing things. Now, I'm certainly not an apologist for the British royal family, because they, to this day, enjoy hunting. They are out there on the glorious 12th in August shooting pheasants and partridge and various other things. But while he was still the Prince of Wales, he went on safari in East Africa. This was in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. And he was accompanied at least once by his then mistress, Thelma Viscountess Furness. She wasn't his only mistress, as we know. Now, originally, these were traditional shooting trips. It's what he enjoyed. But he was given some idea of the scale of loss of creatures. He was appalled by the carnage totting up when he realized it. And instead, he dedicated his later trips to recording the wild animals on film, so shooting them with a camera rather than shooting them with a gun. The Honourable Dennis George Finch Hatton was an aristocratic big game hunter, and he was the lover of Baroness Karen Blixen, the author of the autobiographical Out of Africa, which was first published in 1937. In 1928 and 1930, Finch Hatton played host to the Prince of Wales in a safari that switched from hunting to photography, and the relationship led to King Edward VIII taking up Finch Hatton's cause to abandon weapons on hunting safaris, shifting towards filming big game, wildlife photography, and the founding of the Serengeti National Park. In the film Out of Africa, Finch Hatton was played by Robert Redford, you may remember. Jimmy Stewart famously said, "Animals give me more pleasure through the viewfinder of a camera than they ever did in the crosshairs of a gun sight. And after I finish shooting, my unharmed victims are still around for others to enjoy." Today, the photographic style of safari is dramatically more common than the gun-based style of game rides. Indeed, it's now one of the fastest growing vacation styles, not matching cruising in terms of growth, but it is certainly growing very fast. It's particularly popular amongst Northern Europeans, for whom the overnight flight to India, East Africa, Southern Africa is a fairly easy trip, and particularly, especially the African journeys, on roughly the same time zone as well. And typically visitors will stay in accommodation built for that purpose, purpose-built safari lodges created on the territory that is already home to the wildlife on view. It's also normal for these places to operate breeding programs which both help to protect the species but also provide animals that might not otherwise be found there. The lodges are typically luxurious in every detail, with wildlife visible from the wilderness style but luxurious accommodation. And from the central dining room and terrace areas, it's also possible to see the animals out in their comfortable wild state, where guests will normally dine together on excellent food based on local ingredients and recipes adapted to Western tastes, of course. The day starts with a light snack before the morning game drive aboard something like this. 6 or 8 guests will travel together in a jeep adapted for the purpose. And you can see some magnificent creatures which give us a wonderful up-close view as they pass, if we just sit still. And this again was taken on our visit to the Addo near to Port Elizabeth. What any game drive depends on, whether you're in Bengal, Burma or Namibia, or wherever you may be, It depends largely on the ranger, his powers of sight and hearing, and just what happens to be out that day. Now, not everyone gets to see the big five. We were very lucky, I think on our second trip in South Africa, Kathy and I got to see them all in just a couple of days. It really was quite magnificent. But we've seen the big five and many more besides over the years. I'm not the best photographer, I recognize that, but it still makes me feel quite proud when I look at what we were able to see. And tradition dictates that the ranger will carry with him the passenger's chosen tipple and a decent snack. So there'll be a mid-morning stop for these, more than likely somewhere in the wild. And typically high tea is served before the afternoon or evening drive, and dinner, usually en commune, all together, will be served on return. And weary, but fulfilled, I think most of the travellers on these tours sleep pretty well at night, assisted not just by the fresh air, but by the sounds of the wildlife around them. Or imagine launching at dawn, rising as the sun rises, and gently floating over the plains of the magnificent veldt, or the plains of India, or wherever you may be. Rising as the sun rises, your balloon floats over in whatever direction the winds of the day happen to be moving, and heading over the wonderful area below you. The pilot will use various altitudes and layers of air to navigate as best he can, and will ensure that you see as much of the wildlife below you as he is able to do. Now, of course, no one can predict what you will see, and any two flights will be different. They're never the same, and that's one of the wonders, one of the magical points of it. It's more pronounced in a balloon safari, but it's true of any safari. No one can guarantee what you will see. And after landing, you celebrate in the traditional way with champagne before heading off to a special Raj or out of Africa breakfast in the bush, depending on where you are. And you will find that you have crystal glasses and Sheffield steel cutlery and nice porcelain or china plates to stand or sit with your fellow travellers to make a memorable finale to your adventure. I want to leave you with a thought from Paul Theroux. I quoted him on my first talk on board, and I want to leave you with a thought now, because Paul Theroux tells us that tourists don't know where they've been, while travellers don't know where they're going. Just think about that. I will be back sometime next week with some talks, a couple of, I think I probably have 2 more talks coming, and we'll find some ways of entertaining you more, I'm sure. But for now, thank you very much for joining us, and Kathy and I are here to answer any questions.